most of what we know either comes through the records of the earliest white travelers and traders, or through Zulu oral tradition. And obviously both of those in their own way are flawed sources. From a historian's point of view, they're not flawed in the sense that you expect all your sources to have biases and difficulties. But in fact, it means that you can't use any one. You can't take the diary of Henry Francis Finn, one of the earliest traders. You can't take that and read it and say that's a good picture. Obviously it isn't. You have to have something like Zulu oral tradition to give you the other side of the story. And then there are many versions within Zulu oral tradition. It's not as though there's a Zulu view and the trader's view. There are many different ones. So the historian has to be particularly careful, I think, to try and have a range of sources. And there's a different quality of information that comes from them. Obviously, the traders only saw a very small part of Zululand from a very particular perspective. Zulu oral tradition looks at an entirely different range of topics. But there you have the real dilemma that it's tradition that's come down over time, that's changed as parents tell their children and so on. So historians are a little bit more nervous of using oral tradition, because it's not as fixed. It's not, you can't say, well, whose voice is this? Where does this come from? When was it actually constructed? So what we know is a mixture of these two quite difficult sources. And we lack some of the stuff that historians have for other periods, such as concrete demographic data, those sorts of things, because of the lack of written records.
Okay. We do have to take care with the jangling bangles.
Oh.
Yeah, and also...
Yeah, going on from there, what happened, generally speaking, what happened to African history in the hands of white historians and writers? How was it co-opted to serve white ends, if indeed that's what happened?
The difficulty there, I think, is that the history that was written is primarily the history of whites in, say in this case, in Zulu society, as opposed to Zulu history. So that where you get Zulu history or African history coming through at all, it does so in relation to white events. And often there'll be a prefatory set of remarks which take on board African history in its own right. So in this case, well, Shaka was the king of the Zulus who was born in such and such a year, and these are the circumstances of his accession, and so on and so forth. But leading up to the main story, which is when the first whites arrived and the nature of their interaction, and how that affected white settlement, the beginning in this case of the Natal colony. So the first point that one would want to make there is that African history is sidelined all the time. It's always the background to white history. Once white historians start trying to deal with African history in its own right, they do so as a scene-setting exercise.